goes to some of those meetings, you can even go to smaller scientific meetings because the company people who are there are very interested in that topic for whatever reason, and you can make contacts there. So being out and going to these networking kinds of meetings is a good way to collect cards, meet people, put them in your database. We keyword people. So if it's from Intel, I know that they might be interested in microprocessors or, platform software, et cetera. If it's biotech, that they range all over. They're interested in cardiovascular, or they're interested in cancer, or neurological diseases, et cetera. And we then are able to pull out companies by their areas of interest. Now, companies change all the time, and they keep their interests sort of secret sometimes, broadly available. But many of them will come visit the university and say, well, we're interested in blah, blah, blah. Keep track of those. And so slowly but surely, you'll develop a network of contacts that you can write or call. And it's nice to have just even a few good ones. You can call them and say, I have this technology. It seems really interesting. What do you think? And if you have a good enough relationship, they'll give you candid feedback. Great technology, too hard to manufacture. Not too good of technology, I wouldn't be interested. And then you'll get better feedback to evaluate your invention. So that feedback, even if it's no, if you know the reason they say no, it's a much more valuable thing.
In the US, I learned that you have a very good people who try to donate to the public funds. So Thailand, I can see these opportunities rising as well. Can we learn how the tech transfer office influence the people in the public in how to raise fundings, things like that?
For the public, meaning the government, or?
Yeah, let me put it this way. I think in Thai society now, instead of donate money to the other things, they begin to donate to the hospital or the health research. And I see that in the US, you have this kind of things a lot.
Yes.
So how the tech transfer office involved in this kind of fundraisings?
When Dr. Momura was talking about Berkeley, she was talking about foundations, which I think you're talking about. They are societies that are often put together around diseases, cancer society or multiple sclerosis, et cetera. And they give grants to universities. They're another leg of the research funding. And they're being more interested in intellectual property, because they want to solve that disease problem. They have patients who, if you could find the cure, would be eternally grateful. So they're anxious for the cure, and so they fund research. And a lot of times lately, they've been wanting to have a little bit of more influence on how the intellectual property is handled. And the universities have been having a very serious discussion with these foundations, because the foundations feel like they know the companies that are interested in finding the cures for their disease, and so in some ways they feel they know better. And the universities, being a different entity, they think, we know better and we know tech transfer. But I think if we talk more together, and that's what we're promising them to do, is to work more closely together. If they know companies who are interested in the technologies, of course we would love to contact them. Because again, we both want the same thing. We want this technology to be transferred. Lately, there are more very wealthy individuals who are starting foundations. Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg started one. Sean Parker started the Parker Institute. So they are, because they're from the high-tech sector, and many times they don't know what university tech transfer is like, they think they know better. And so they've been imposing a lot more rules on us, or conditions on their money. And so, again, the only way to help make it smoother is to educate them, and we get more educated by them, and work together. I always do think working together and understanding each other's culture makes for a better outcome.
Yes. Is your technology licensing office co-invest with the private venture when they come and negotiate the license?
Let's see. We co-invest, but not through our office. So typically in a license to a startup, because it's privately held, we will often take equity and upfront money. We feel like cash still is real. Equity is lottery money. And then we'll have a normal license. So we'll take this equity and we split it up with the inventor, just like we do with our royalty sharing policy. What we do, though, as you know, is often we could get diluted in the various rounds. And so a presidential decree from many, many years ago required that we, Stanford, be able to invest in future rounds, real money. This real money doesn't come from our office. It would be a conflict of interest, right? Because then we're going to gain from licensing startups. But the President's Fund, there's a special President's Fund, they invest in the future rounds, and we try to keep our pro rata share until they go public. Now, it's separate from our office, but the theory is that there is more likelihood of success of Stanford startups than general. And we've had a history of, it's about 15 years, and you have to take the long view, because we have put in more money than has been returned, but I think in the long term, it will pay out. So we do invest, but it's not through their direct funds like in Cambridge or I think Berkeley.
Hi, I have questions about, is there like tech transfer personnel kind of like in demand in the job market?
Are they in demand? Yeah.
Yeah.
They're in demand.
In the US, right?
In the US.
Oh, not to mention Thailand. And what kind of background does the tech transfer personnel need to have so that like we can, I think Thailand, these tech transfer personnel are very in demand. How can university produce these kind of like personnel to serve the market?
So it's interesting because every university has different kinds of criteria for the kind of people they want in technology transfer. So I can't answer across the board. There's some universities that are really legally focused, and they would like a lawyer to be head of the office. There are other offices that want a PhD to be head of the office. Of course, a PhD gives scientific credibility to the faculty, let's say, and so they feel like they can talk to a colleague. At Stanford, we never did that. In fact, we felt we should be generalists. And so we didn't hire against PhDs, but we didn't require it in any way. So if you had one, fine, but if you didn't, that's fine. We also didn't want to necessarily hire MBAs, although we will. But an MBA can do all your spreadsheets and your forecasts on existing product. Well, our stuff is not existing generally. So you can't do a spreadsheet and forecast, and it's not a numbers game like that. So again, what we required was a technical background. We do feel like you have to be able to talk to the inventor. I don't feel like you should even want to compete with the inventor. You're not going to have to understand the technology in such detail, because what we have to do is translate that technology into essentially layman's language so that the regular world can understand it. So again, we don't want to be highly technical, because if you send a highly technical abstract to a company, nobody will read it. So they can always get more information later. So again, we feel like an outward-facing, technology-savvy, interesting person, a person who's interested in a lot of things. And for us, it's more a generalist. I feel like I know a little bit about a lot of things. I don't know very much deeply, except for this business, but we see so many kinds of inventions and so many different companies that you can't go too deep sometimes.
Have you ever transferred the technology that later on proved that it's not working? That is not working?
Oh yeah, lots of technologies don't work. Are you kidding?
How did you manage to gain the trust from the private sector afterward?
Well, I don't feel like it's our fault if the technology doesn't work. I mean, they need to do due diligence, right? There is no promise that this technology is going to work. Usually it's a petri dish or a small prototype in the university laboratory. There is no promise. In our agreement, we say there is no guarantee that this works for anything. So many of them, the technology is just too hard, or it's not practical, or they can't scale up. And yes, the licensee terminates the license. They decide, not us.
Sorry, again, I'd just like to ask you, since nowadays the market changing so fast. Before that, we know that the shelf life of the products lasts about 2 years and then 1 year. But nowadays, probably 6 months. Okay, so to be a best guest to select the technology for transferring, is there any involvement on your office on such a work?
To select the projects for technology transfer or to select the project for research?
You have inventors, okay? And then inventors would meet with the investor or company, and then the duration of the finishing to commercialization now is so short than we used to be learning. So how you do it in so short term in order to meet a market demand of the products?
So if we can see the product coming out, let's say in 2 years, I don't think we're going to solve that problem. It takes, I don't know, 5 years, 3 years to 5 years for a patent to issue. So there's not even going to be protection. If it's an improvement that's too fast, then we probably wouldn't file. We need to file on inventions that are very basic in nature. So for instance, when optical fibers and optical technology was hot, I always thought that was definitely going to be of the future, and it is of the future. It's just many times the future took much longer than we thought. Other times it's very fast, like the autonomous car. We have a lot of research in that area now, and that actually started a long time ago at Stanford. So I feel like many times with technology transfer, we see it way early. So I used to handle some technologies like gallium arsenide, and I thought for sure it's going to come, or germanium silicon. For sure it's going to come, because we need to change from silicon, and it sort of still hasn't come yet. It's probably been 20 or more years. So we can't predict necessarily, but you know that AI is big now, and autonomous cars, drones, etc. Oh, time's up. Ding. Thank you very much. So I'm very informal, and I just thought this would be a Q&A session if you have any questions for me. We've had a long experience at Stanford, one of the oldest offices in the US. So I know you're thinking of doing more in technology transfer, and if you have any questions of us, I'd be glad to answer them.
Okay, so from your presentation, when you talk about the conflicts of interest that your office kind of looking at that, and one point that you said like you don't want the student to involve, And I'm kind of curious, like how when student they go to college, they got some ideas and they want to go out and have some spin-off and startups. How can they, under Stanford model, how can they do that?
So as you know, they're undergraduate students and graduate students. So undergraduates, we will typically not own their inventions unless they use Stanford facilities to develop the technology. But many times there are entrepreneurial courses, or they'll use Stanford, Stanford offices to meet or something to come up with a startup. We don't usually take those kinds of inventions as being owned by Stanford. If they use our laboratory, we would own those inventions. Now, students, undergraduate students, they don't have so much of a responsibility to Stanford. So many times they can just start their company without any approval or anything like that. Graduate students can start their own companies too, but we don't want them to be sort of dissuaded from doing their research. And so typically if they're going to start a company while doing the same kind of research in the laboratory, it probably wouldn't be allowed. They would have to, many times they're almost going to graduate. They've already written their dissertation and just have to defend. So then they can start a company and after they graduate. So students do start companies. Typically, like in biotech and life sciences, they usually need a faculty member who has some credibility to start the company. And so typically a faculty member will start the companies. So we have all flavors of startup companies. Now our conflict of interest policy, as I was telling the other group, is we try to market the technology broadly, and then we try to decide who would be the best licensee. That's our criteria. Sometimes nobody's interested except the startup company, like in Google case, nobody was interested in this technology. Other times, there are several companies who might be interested in the technology, and we would ask them to write a development plan. Tell us how you're going to develop the technology. And again, then our office would have to choose which licensee would be the best one to develop this, commercialize this technology. Now, many times the startup has no experience and no money, and the existing company has experience and some money. But the question for our office is, who cares most about this technology? Who is really committed to developing it? And we do know that many existing companies, especially big ones, they'll take on a project, develop it for a few years, and then decide this is not in their strategic plan, and they'll just shelve it. And that's not what we want. And so, again, many times we might choose the startup as a licensee, even if there's an existing company who wants the technology. Particularly if we think the inventor involvement is critical. Sometimes it's so early stage and the inventor needs to help move this to the private sector, in which case maybe the startup makes sense. And again, we have an ecosystem in the US where small startups are either acquired by larger companies or they partner with larger companies. And so again, there is a mechanism for them to grow if they can grow. So often we will license the startup company. The process, the technical process at Stanford is our office will describe how we marketed the technology, what the response was, and why we were going to choose this particular company, the startup company, to be the licensee. And then the faculty, typically faculty, sometimes the student will write a description of how they'll be involved with the company, how they will separate their research at Stanford from the research at the company, because we don't want them to mingle too much. And then if the conflict of interest people, this is a different group, reviews this and feels comfortable with it, then they'll give us approval to do a license agreement. And again, typically, most times we say okay, it's sort of a management rather than prohibition of conflict of interest.
Hi, I have a probably more of a tactical question on licensing. Say one has a technology that's a bit tricky to bring into commercialization, but by leveraging a collaboration with a large established firm, or by licensing that tech to a large established firm, the technology has a higher prospects of being brought to the market. But that large established firm would like to see that technology being commercialized first, perhaps like the first version, something like that, launched with a great market reception before they would license that tech, right? So it's like a chicken and egg problem.
Right.
Do you have any advice on this from your experience? What kind of solutions do you provide, or what tactics would work in this scenario?
Well, again, we don't necessarily provide solutions that way, but as you describe it, there's a big company who's interested in the technology, but they really don't want to take a license until it's more developed and sort of proven, which is a chicken and an egg because they want their cake and eat it too. Right? They don't want to take the risk. So if your inventor is entrepreneurial enough, they could start the company. The large company could invest in the small company, and the small company could then develop the technology further, maybe launch it, or maybe develop it further so that the company, the large company, feels like it has been de-risked. And then the large company can acquire the small company, or they can partner with a sales or distribution or development agreement. So we find that this staging model is actually quite good, especially in biotech. I think in the US, that's the model. Small biotech company starts, develops the technology for several years, and the large company partners with them or acquires them or does some agreement with them. So that works actually quite well. Now, if your student or your inventor is not that entrepreneurial, then you're going to have to find a smaller company to de-risk it, or you ask the company to, give them a cheap license at the beginning so that they will invest in the technology, and then as it moves forward, then you ask for a higher percentage.
To promote the spin-off, do you have any specific licensing condition to that company?
We began, one of my first slides was how entrepreneurial we are at Stanford and the Silicon Valley. So in many ways, we don't feel we need to promote spin-offs because all these people want to do startups anyway. So again, in theory, and I don't necessarily think that every university can follow our model because you don't have the same entrepreneurial culture. But typically, we view an agreement with a startup pretty much the same as an agreement with an existing company. So the only difference typically will be equity, because the startup usually doesn't have much money to spend, much cash to spend. So we will take some equity in the company as partial consideration. We always want a little bit of cash because cash is real. As I said in the earlier session, equity is monopoly money. It's a gambling money. And so we'll take equity, but we have same diligence. We'll have minimum annual payments. We'll have an earned royalty. We'll have diligence. So pretty much the startup license is very similar to a license to an existing company. So this gentleman asked, what's a typical licensing fee? Well, how much would you pay for a car? What's a typical car payment? The trouble is, so I analogize to buying a car. Are you going to buy a Mercedes or are you going to buy a junker? Is it going to be old or is it going to be new? Is it going to be fancy and with all the gadgets, or is it going to be basic? What model are you going to bring? So to say what is an average price to me is not fair. Even what's an average price for a house? Well, the range is huge. So again, from our perspective, it's it's a reasonable amount of money, and reasonable is in the eyes of the beholder, right? For some startups, 5,000 seems huge. For other startups, 5,000 is cheap. So again, it can range. Typically, I hope we can get $10,000 at a minimum, but some of them are lower or higher. Some of them are much higher. And then we try to get yearly payments. Again, at the beginning, they're taking a risk. We're taking a risk with them, so it's going to be modest payments. Sometimes there's all sorts of ways you can do this. You can make the payments go higher and then earn royalties at the end of the day. So again, depending on the kind of company and what their concerns are, you can negotiate the financials to make sense for both parties.
I have two questions. Once you mentioned about the equity, I wonder, do you have any policy or when are you going to sell the equity? Okay, that's one. Another one, in your office, do you manage the percentage when you're talking about the inventors? If there are so many inventors, do you manage the percentage on each inventor, or they do it themselves?
That's the easier question, the inventor's share. So I said 1/3 goes to the inventors. Our office position is that it's even. And if they want it to be uneven, some inventor groups feel like one inventor might deserve more. They need to work it out. We are not in the position to know which inventor contributed more or less. And actually, all the inventors have to sign off on it. And so if they come to us with a different royalty sharing and they've all agreed on it, that's fine with us. We don't have any opinion. But given no other information, it'll be even among all the inventors. So then the second question was, when do we sell our equity? How do we know when to sell? Again, because we have equity and we know about the company, we could be accused of insider trading. So we pretty much sell whenever we can, as soon as it's liquidatable. So if it's a private company that goes public, usually there's a lockup period, 6 months, and then we will sell. Now, sometimes we have a lot of equity, let's say in Google, or we had a fair amount of equity in a DSL company, digital subscriber line company, and we don't want to be viewed as dumping our stock, right, if we had a fair amount. So we will sell it over a year, even tranches over a year. But we try to liquidate as soon as possible. We don't try to play the market.
For faculties who receive the license, do you know whether how Stanford recognize them besides them receiving after they receive the right license?
We as a university don't necessarily recognize them, but our office likes to recognize inventors. And so we have a Stanford Invention Hall of Fame. And on that one, we say any inventor whose invention made $5 million or more, they're on our plaque of Stanford Inventions Wall of Fame. We've had parties where we have prolific inventors. As I mentioned, some inventors invent a lot. Now, of course, if you invent a lot but nothing gets licensed, that's not very useful for us. So we define prolific inventor as someone who's invented more than 7 inventions, I think that was. I mean, it's all arbitrary. 7 inventions whose total was $500,000 or more. And so again, your office can create ways to recognize inventors that you want to.
So when you say you take the equity in the spin-out, is it the Stanford University or is the Office of Technology Licensing? So my question is it a separate legal entity or is the same entity?
Our office is within the university, so Office of Technology License is not a separate entity. So when we take equity, it's in the name of Stanford University. And we do share the equity with inventors. So even if it's the inventor startup, that inventor is going to get some equity through us. And so we asked the company to issue those shares in the name of the inventor directly, because we don't want to really hold on to the inventor's share, because they may want to sell it at a later date than we would, for example. So we let the company issue the stock directly to the inventors. The rest of it stays as Stanford University.
Do inventors participate in the negotiations of the license?
Do they participate in the negotiation? No. And it depends on, what our relationship with the inventor is. Sometimes the inventor is not the startup. It's, let's say we're licensing an existing company, and we will talk to the inventor. When they're really strictly on Stanford's side, we'll talk to them about the diligence. Does this make sense? Do you think this is a reasonable timeline, et cetera? We'll ask for their input. If the inventor is also on the company side, we don't talk to them as much because there is a conflict of interest there. But again, we want the inventor to think of their self as mostly being on the Stanford side if possible, when we're asking for their advice on licensing practices and strategies.
So in one of the slides, I saw your revenue. Sorry, the OTL actually have a sharp drop, like a cliff there. Would you worry? And I always heard that actually the OTL actually has been operated by its own revenue, right? And how would you attack this problem here? And I know you're retired, but it's a little worrisome, no? Yes?
Yes. So, as I said early on, it took 15 years to be self-sufficient on that 15%. And then we were self-sufficient for many, many years because we grew slowly and we grew based on this income. Then we had this big patent, brought in $660 million over time. It was about $60 million per year. Went